So welcome to our webinar, Beavers in Our Landscape. It's really a pleasure to provide this information. Our role today is to help talk about the ecological role of beavers in our landscapes, as well as some of the management and social considerations that we need to think about in terms of living and understanding living with beavers, which can be a challenge sometimes. So my name is Noreen Ambrose. I work for an organization called Cows and Fish, and this webinar was put together specifically to be delivered to Alberta Environment and Parks staff with a focus on providing background information to those involved in both the regulatory and compliance side, as well as others interested in learning about beavers and their management. So the organization I work for is called Cows and Fish, and as the name suggests, we started many years ago working a lot with agricultural producers around streams with fish, but we do work with all sorts of landowners, and our focus, of course, in that interface is riparian, and that riparian area is that area influenced by water where there's extra vegetation that's greener, different soils. And so want to learn more about what we do, of course, feel free to go to our website. We do work a lot with agricultural producers, but also rural municipalities, urban areas, and the public. And so what I want to talk today about is how do beavers interface with our landscape. They do change the landscape physically. They are known as the ecosystem engineers because of their ability to actually change their environment around them through their dam building in particular. And this started us off on a collaborative quite a few years ago, particularly with the MIISTAKIS Institute. And we've coined this project, putting beavers to work, as in kind of using what they do to recognize the value that they can benefit society and landowners, and support watershed resiliency and restoration, which is a grant that we have from Alberta Environment and Parks with that focus, which I'll talk a bit more about later. Beavers, of course, are an integral part of our landscape and are considered a real icon for Canada, with over 700 place names having beaver in their name, and 50 of those in Alberta, which is where we're recording this webinar. So they're a pretty important part of our landscape and our society, including the nickel. You might wonder why or what the role is here with cows and fish and beavers, but of course beavers are part of riparian areas and aquatic habitats, and that is of course a part of what we do. And so beavers are a component of helping understand how our landscapes work, particularly these transition zones between the drier upland and the truly aquatic habitat. And as this picture shows, riparian areas are comparatively easy to see in dry landscapes, but not as maybe as obvious always in more moist habitats and moist ecoregions. And so our role is at Cows and Fish is to help better interpret or understand the interaction that beavers have with this piece of the land. And of course, these mammals are something that we maybe don't see a lot, but they certainly are quite present in Alberta and surrounding jurisdictions. And in the presence of what we do see is often the things that they've done. We might not see the mammal themselves, but we often see the work they've been busy at. And sometimes we might consider that rather destructive work, like cutting an amazing number of trees for what might seem to be no apparent reason. And so that what seemingly might seem to be destruction to us, it causes us a lot of frustration, anger, consternation, and sometimes downright problems. That can include things like flooding of our crops and our roads, plugging of culverts that then have to somehow be unplugged, and flooding of roads because those culverts aren't unplugged can cause a real problem for people, and not only in terms of convenience, but costs and money and even safety. And so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the techniques related to these kinds of things, as well as others. This collaborative started, as I mentioned, a number of years ago with the MIISTAKIS Institute of the Rockies, with also working with the Anne and Sandy Cross Conservation Area, who'd been doing some beaver reintroductions, and it involved a citizen science project with high school students to get them involved in understanding the role that beavers play some ecological skill sets in terms of their ability to monitor the outdoors. And through that, it's led us to do a number of things, including collaborations with people in Montana and Idaho to do a workshop. When the WRRP, the Watershed Resiliency and Restoration Program, was developed, one of the things that was done was to look at the important areas that could or should be focused on, and it was looked at both from a flood and a drought perspective. And one of the things that this map highlights is that much of southern Alberta is considered a really high priority, and that means at risk for drought. And so beavers can play in a really important role in that resiliency about addressing drought, and I'll talk more about how that is. But that might lead me to say they're good, but a lot of people might be more inclined to say that beavers are bad, that they aren't very highly appreciated because of all the challenges and problems that they can cause. And yet the way that our continent got settled was because people loved beaver pelts, and that was, of course, to make the hats that Europeans were wearing beginning in the 1500s. That this exploration and settlement of North America, of course, happened because of a fashion trend across the ocean. And although mostly they aren't drawing attention for those reasons today, beaver pelts are actually still used in the Stetson hat, the cowboy hat today. So I want to talk a little bit about basic beaver biology. Of course, they're a mammal. They have webbed feet and a very wide, flat tail that help them with swimming. Their eyes, ears, and noses essentially close or exclude water, so they're really great swimmers. And they can stay underwater for up to 15 minutes. So they're very, very well adapted to an aquatic lifestyle. But of course, a lot of their food also comes from on land. And a lot of that food can be woody. And so their teeth grow throughout their lifetime, with the front face, that orange enamel layer, being tougher and harder to erode than the back layer. And because of that difference between the front and the back of their toughness, it keeps their teeth sharp. So when they're eating, they're constantly sharpening their teeth, essentially. And a typical beaver colony is, of course, doing the business of being a beaver with two adults. They are monogamous. The female actually acts as the matriarch of the family, and they generally have a couple young of the year, as well as a couple young from the prior year in the same colony. Those 2-year-olds disperse generally at spring runoff or freshet, because that's when there's higher water and there's more mobility within aquatic ecosystems. And they can typically might move anywhere from 18 to 25 kilometers, but they have been recorded as moving, beavers are moving over 280 kilometers. So they can move very long distances if they want or required to do so. Beavers die from, at least in lots of parts of North America, they're both from predation, hunting or trapping, are important mortality causes, as well as disease transmission like tularemia. They, of course, sometimes befall bad things, like maybe they aren't as good a woodcutter as they'd like to be, but there are a diversity of mortality causes. One interesting thing that you may have heard of course, the thing called beaver fever, and that's also known as Giardia. It actually isn't certainly just from beavers that it's transmitted. Giardia in one study actually was shown to only be in 13% of beaver in a population of beavers, but it was over 90% of muskrats had Giardia cysts within them. So maybe it should have been called muskrat fever instead of beaver fever. Part of staying alive throughout the year, of course, is caching food, and beavers do that in the water around their lodges. Most beavers do live in a lodge, although some will live in banks in a river system, which is too large, for instance, for them to dam, in ponds, which are either from natural ponds and lakes, or in ponds that they've built in smaller stream systems. With their damming, they'll build up a cache of material that they cut. So lots of twigs that they basically partially submerge in the water. So when winter comes and the water freezes, they still have access to that material and they can avoid predation. They do build their dams with trees and shrubs a lot of the time, but they also build those dams with any other material they can find. This is a prairie system. You can see they have focused entirely on using mud and cattails, and they can certainly use a wide diversity of materials to build dams. But generally, they do like to build them in sequence, as the photo on the right shows. That gives them more overall habitat, more deep habitat, and more swimmable habitat when they create a series of dams. They do generally like very low gradient stream systems, or even connected wetland systems, less than 3% ideally. And they generally like wider, flatter valleys, such as a 45-meter or more width of space. They also generally need enough aspen and willow, although they can survive in places without much of those. That's certainly their preferential place. And that's basically because they have to have enough food to survive. They, certainly in Alberta and other places, drawdown from water bodies is quite common, but they generally don't survive and don't inhabit systems that are fluctuating more than 1.5 meters, and not in the winter having that drawdown more than 70 centimeters, because then they tend to either not have enough water left, or perhaps they get exposed due to predators at their lodge level. We also have this sense that beavers do eat, wood, and although about half of their diet is wood, in the spring and summer it's very much less a part of their diet than it is in winter, and they will, as I mentioned, eat all kinds of things, and that includes things like cattails, water lilies, and other kinds of plants. They will eat terrestrial plants as well as aquatic plants. Of the woody plants they do eat, aspen and willow are two of their favored species for sure. When they eat poplars or aspen, the poplars respond from being cut by adding additional undesirable or bitter tasting compounds, and that encourages the beaver to cut bigger stems that don't have those compounds. In contrast, when they cut willows, which is what you see on the right, actually encourages more sprouting and rooting, and willows don't release or add those extra bitter compounds. So it's generally considered that willows and beavers are mutualists, as in they're mutually beneficial to one another. When they use a lot of that wood, some of it's eaten, but it's also used for dam building. And unlike human dams, beaver dams generally are leaky. They not only have water, of course, running over the top when they are as full as they can be, but they also have water running through small cracks and crevices. And the water running over the top, as well as through cracks and crevices, finds many diverse pathways, as you can see in this photo. Part of that, the value of that, is that it reduces the hydraulic pressure behind the dam, and of course that means it doesn't have to be as big and as strong, and that also allows movement of other species such as fish or smaller aquatic organisms. Occasionally, beavers eat themselves at house and home, and they aren't maintaining their dams and their dams break, but or perhaps they're all due to predation, or the habitat quality is insufficient, so they vacate an area. And that certainly does happen, but more often than not, beaver dams can last a very long time. They can blow out due to extremely high rain or runoff events from snowmelt, but generally the whole dam doesn't go. It usually breaks at one particular point. So I want to talk a little bit now about the sort of bigger picture role and the sort of ecological functions that beavers influence in the watershed. So, of course, water storage is an important part. This is a picture actually of Beaver Creek in southwestern Alberta in the early 2000s when it was completely dry. So it wasn't storing too much water, obviously, but beavers are an integral part of maintaining water in our systems, and certainly rural landowners recognize that role as well. But sort of starting at the bigger, longer term pictures, beavers modify valleys by building those extensive series of dams over time. And that dam building changes sinuosity, encourages water to slow down, and of course it traps material and sediment. When it's trapping that sediment, it's holding that sediment back from other systems. Of course, we have natural sediment in our streams and rivers, but our land use practices certainly do increase the amount of material that's in runoff and snowmelt as sediment. And so beavers can play an important part of holding back and trapping some of that material. And talk a little bit more about the amount later. But if you imagine that happening over thousands of years since glaciers left our landscape, if you think about in the top left photo or image number 1, the relatively steep, narrow valleys. Over time, as water is built up by beavers, it traps material, which then grows new plants. It widens that sort of flat-bottomed area, and we end up with what seem to be more broad, flat valley bottoms as we trap sediment over millennia. That trapping of sediment in today's terms is, of course, extremely beneficial for water quality management. And so there's been some interesting research about the amount of sediment that's trapped or stored in a pond behind a dam. And it's highly variable, of course, depending on the system and the how much sediment is arriving, as well as the size of the water body. But it can vary from 35 to 6,500 cubic meters of sediment. And that 6,500 cubic meters of sediment is equivalent to over 380 tandem trucks of soil. And so if we think about the value that beavers play in just trapping of material that we don't want necessarily running down our streams, that's pretty important. So not only are they trapping the solids, but of course with those solids, they're trapping nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. They're sequestering carbon, and of course they're reducing fecal coliforms as well as other coliforms by trapping those materials, which tend to be attached or bound to nutrients. So in systems that aren't necessarily streams and rivers, particularly the ponds that are they've either built, or natural wetlands and lake margins, beavers also add additional water storage by building canals or beaver runs, which I'm sure anybody that's walked around these areas has fallen into a couple unexpectedly deeper than they thought, a bit like this cartoon suggests. And so that actually, although it seems like something rather small, it actually can be quite a significant addition to water storage in these kinds of sites. And not only in these systems that have beaver runs or canals, but also in general around beaver ponds, the amount of water that's trapped and stored underground can be 5 to 10 times as much as what we see at the surface, because there's such a wide lateral expanse, up to hundreds of meters away sideways, and 300 to 600 meters downstream from a pond behind a dam. So the amount of water storage in groundwater is again a really, really important role playing the watershed resiliency. And that's both at the immediate level, but also the longer term. In watersheds with beaver ponds, from 30 to 60% of the water can be in those ponds. And there's been some interesting research that looked at historical records and compared during drought periods watersheds with versus without beaver evidence. And those watersheds with beavers during drought periods continue to have much more water than areas in watersheds without beavers before the drought. And that's even if the beavers maybe can't always persist because the water levels get a bit low, their structures persist longer than they do. And again, that helps store water. Ruth, I'm having trouble, it won't advance. There we go. Because of the extra water stored behind dams and recharging groundwater, the downstream flow can be from 2 to 10 times greater below beaver dams. And it isn't, of course, that they magically create new water, but it's because they've held on to it and trapped it and stored it, that it can persist and increase that flow that wouldn't otherwise have been there, compared to neighboring sites that don't have those opportunities. So they not only store and hold water, of course, these beaver dams, but they also dissipate energy. They act as speed bumps in streams by slowing down the water, adding roughness, and preventing as much erosion. If you think about a beaver pond, although they're not all as sort of messy looking as this picture with logs everywhere, they certainly do have a roughness that's different than just a straight stream channel would have. And so they don't necessarily take the big peaks off of floods, but they help reduce the peaks of smaller floods, and they help slow down the water to reduce the flood damage. So they have a value both in the drought and the flood side of things. By holding on to that water, they're also changing the temperature of it. So the water that's stored in groundwater tends to come back into streams or wetlands or lakes. If that's the situation, it comes back into those surface water bodies colder during the summer and sometimes warmer in the winter. So that can be quite beneficial from a fish perspective. And of course, in many of our habitats in North America, where we have challenges with habitat quality, water temperature issues, and oxygen levels for fish, beavers can be a part of that solution. In fact, there's some interesting work happening in the Northwest US where they are using beavers as a restoration tool for salmon habitat. So keeping in mind all the different things that beavers do, they not only store water, but they change the geomorphology and the hydrology of the site. They trap material, they improve the nutrients. They, of course, are creating a wetland by creating that pond, or they expand the size of it and therefore also increase the size of the riparian zone that's associated with it. That trapping of materials, improving water quality, and they're, of course, modifying or changing the ecosystem and the habitat around the area. So the work they do is about retaining, detaining, storing, and slowly releasing. So if we kind of capture all of what they do in those four sort of actions, we can kind of visualize what's happening with beavers on the landscape and in our watersheds. So now I want to shift a little bit and talk about some of the work we've been doing to share these messages. So like this webinar, we have a series of workshops that we've been hosting, and basically at the request of communities, they contact us and are looking to learn more about beavers and beaver management. And so we've done about a dozen of these since 2014 with local communities across Alberta. And so that's something that if you're interested in, you can let us know about. We also, my colleague Lauren Fitch completed this document about a year and a half ago, which is very much similar to the content in this presentation, but of course expanded. So if you're interested in more information, feel free to contact us or go to our website. We can certainly get you a paper copy if you're interested in that as well. We have an online order form, and you can request a copy. So one of the other things we've been doing is looking at the literature to try to make the case that beaver benefits are actually valuable. They're not just something that's sort of a feel-good. There's an economic benefit to beavers. There are costs to beavers, but if we don't put numbers to both sides, it's hard to have a constructive conversation. And so this was some work done actually in the Escalante River basin in Utah. They actually said, well, we think we need to add beavers back into these systems because they used to be here. But before we go doing that, we want to understand the costs and the benefits of what that might do for us. And they were looking particularly at water storage, water quality related parameters. And as you can see in this slide, one of the things that they saw was a huge economic valuation of the ecosystem services provided by beavers in the hundreds of millions of dollars per year on the low end when you add them all together. And that's obviously an ongoing benefit that's going to be gained with beavers. Then you can at least use that number and think about what are the costs that beavers provide, such as the infrastructure damage, and balancing those out about how to make those comparisons. Another thing we've been doing is gathering case studies from other places, learning from others, and some really interesting stuff was shown in what's called the Beaver Whisperer video. You can find it on YouTube, on CBC as well. Michelle Leclerc, who worked in Gatineau Park, or has worked in Gatineau Park for many decades, had been basically battling beavers for many, many years, constantly removing dams, removing beavers, trying to address the problems that they were causing. And he decided he needed to approach things in a different way, and started looking at it from a different perspective. Instead of battling the beavers, to try and find solutions that focused on directing beavers away from areas of conflict, minimizing those conflicts, and understanding beaver ecology to make the best choices possible from a management perspective. And one of those was recognizing that beavers key into the sound of running water. So if there's a sound of running water, they're trying to build dams in those locations. And if you can use that understanding, you can encourage them in some places as well as discourage them in others. And so he began doing drainage of this park area in a different way, looking at pond levelers, which is shown in the bottom right, to keep the beavers there, but not drain the entire pond. So the idea is, and I'll talk more about this, is what level of water depth can you live with, or are you happy with, and building devices that allow that to happen. And then you aren't constantly trying to remove the beavers or remove their dams, but rather set a height at which that dam is going to be persisting. And so using their life history and their behavioral traits to work with them instead of against them, including things like on the left, a beaver dam analog. So building and encouraging beavers to build from some startups that you give them, by knowing where you're okay with that happening, where that flooding might actually occur, encourage them in places where that's acceptable. So back a little closer to home in Alberta, Beaver County, aptly named, which is east of the city of Edmonton, began working with the University of Alberta researchers, Glynis Hood and others, to look at how do they mitigate that human-beaver conflict through adaptive management. And Beaver County, like many parts of central the parkland in Alberta, has relatively low gradient streams and lots of potential beaver habitat, and generally quite a lot of conflicts with beavers. And so they were looking at it from a municipal perspective. How do we reduce the conflicts with that ratepayers are having with beavers, and in municipal infrastructure management, likewise, how do we minimize costs and conflicts and compare the costs to the benefits? And so these are just some pictures of some of the techniques they had historically been using. They regularly have plug culverts. They're trying to put grates over them to prevent access to the beaver. But in general, they were looking at something different and new that would be more effective long term. And so they actually did a bunch of installation of the pond leveling devices I mentioned, and tracked the cost of those compared to the traditional getting in with the big backhoe, unplugging systems, and maintaining those infrastructure in the sort of conventional ways that people are used to doing versus newer pond leveler systems. And working with Dr. Manalur at the U of A, they compared cost benefits at 12 sites that were installed at the Blackfoot Cooking Lake Provincial Recreation Area, and recognized that over 3 years that would save $80,000. So again, it's about putting some numbers to these things, and certainly that suggests that economically it makes a lot of sense to try these new techniques. So as opposed to some of our traditional approaches, which is blowing up beaver dams repeatedly, because beavers tend to come back and rebuild. If it's good habitat or good conditions, it's likely going to be re-inhabited by beavers again, which isn't a very productive approach, because you have to keep redoing it. If you can find something that's more sustainable and not requiring as much repeat time, energy, and money, that seems like a good idea. And so there's lots of efforts to exclude beavers through fencing techniques, but one of the things that we've learned in the process is how you build that fence is important in terms of its success. And this isn't maybe the best style or shape, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. Another way that we can, of course, exclude beavers is individual tree wrapping, which especially at an individual landowner level or an urban level is done quite a lot, but you have to put strong enough wire, you have to put it tall enough, and to keep the beavers from cutting around it or through it. You can also look at changing the way we manage habitat that will influence how beavers occupy it. And that, I think, is one thing that's a little bit harder for us to grasp, but I think it has a lot of potential. Looking at, are we getting beavers in places we don't want them because they're the only places left that are good quality habitat? Are we thinking about diverting beavers in places where we would be happy to have them and not necessarily have any, infrastructure management concerns or conflicts? So thinking about how we make habitat available, but also how we manage our landscapes to ensure that there is habitat for beavers in places that maybe would reduce conflict. We've also been working with a number of collaborators who are to learn from what they're doing, which is feeding beavers. So this is certainly not something you do on a large scale, but these are a couple natural areas and public places that have a wealth of aspen available to them, and so are cutting it in nearby areas and feeding beavers to keep them in certain areas and maintain the smaller number of trees that are close to a site, which works in select situations. Probably the most common and maybe typical thing that we are familiar with is the way to get rid of beavers is, of course, to shoot or to trap them and kill, and that is kill trap them. But more often in other jurisdictions, they're also looking at live trapping, and that, although that's not really a very viable option yet in Alberta because there are very limited guidelines and directives on how to best do that, that might be something that's more an option in the future here in Alberta. It certainly is something that's happening elsewhere. And trapping in general, whether it's live or lethal trapping, can be part of a management plan in terms of where beavers are and how many are where. But if we want to look at coexistence, one of the things we need to do is learn how to do it. And so we've been very fortunate to work with the Fur Bearers Alliance at 7 different locations using exclusion devices, which is essentially fencing out beavers, and pond levelers, as I mentioned. And so we're trying to build a community of practice of people who have familiarity and learn and start to try out these things in their own jurisdictions with some good training skills. And so this set of pictures shows a couple sites in an urban park in Calgary where the beavers had repeatedly been plugging the small culvert, or in the case on the left, small footbridge, mostly with spruce because there wasn't much left to cut that wasn't spruce. But the goal was to not have flooding at these walkway sites, but yet also, of course, not remove beavers. And so that led to working with the city and Fur Bearers ourselves to install, with volunteer help, pond leveler. The idea being that you put the pond leveler, the upstream end, underwater, covered by a cage so beavers can't plug it up, and then you put the other downstream end through the dam, and that sets the height at which the maximum water height will be, and it creates a sort of bit of control of height. This is an example. You can see at another site we've worked at, much deeper water situation. Same idea. But looking at, again, controlling the height. This was a bridge and road at the upstream level that there were some flooding concerns, and so again, setting the pond leveler in place to reduce the amount of flooding around the bridge and road. When you're building these exclusion fences, this is again a City of Calgary example, one is to recognize that you want to keep a bit of a trapezoidal so that the shape base upstream of the fence is bigger than what's at the culvert at the point that they're likely to plug, so you end up with angled sides to reduce the beaver's ability to build against it and use it as a dam that they can add on to essentially. Sometimes you put the devices in combination. This is a site in the MDF foothills. So you have an exclusion fence in the bottom left with a pipe in it that goes out into the deeper water and again prevents access. In this case, the beavers were repeatedly plugging this culvert, which was at the base of a county road, which was regularly causing flooding and issues to infrastructure, and extremely difficult to address with standard methods of getting big equipment down a steep slope, trying to unplug that culvert. So this site, for instance, has been in place for a year and a bit, and they haven't had any issues. It's been completely successful, no management concerns, and except for removing a few sticks that floated up against it. The maintenance has been very low, and it certainly didn't require the cost and the equipment that was required prior to putting this technique in. So these, as well as other sites, are forming demonstration sites, and we're tracking their health with doing repair and health assessment and inventory to help share these coexistence techniques and also the impact of them over time. Some of the other ones demonstration sites were involved in include things like these beaver-proof culverts. We have a T-shaped culvert, and part of the T is in the water, and it's very hard for the beavers to plug uphill. They can't sort of stand on their back feet and just put stuff above their head to plug the culvert. So works very well. And I think it's really about us recognizing that there are a whole bunch of different techniques, ways of thinking about things that maybe instead of battling the beavers, there are some things we can look at in terms of how we manage and build infrastructure in the future, for instance, rather than have to fix it after it's in place. And those beaver-proof culverts are just one example of things we can think about in terms of just doing things differently to reduce or prevent conflict from happening. And it's really about looking at both time and space in a longer term span, and not just the immediacy of what we need to deal with, the reactionary approaches we tend to take that beavers cause, which is, you know, they're causing a problem, we need to fix it. We can step back and start looking at it at a bigger time scale, a bigger space scale. We can maybe address the challenges they pose by preventing them in the first place. And so this is an example of where a beaver dam had failed and the beavers had abandoned it. And so you can see all the sediment had trapped, and it maybe looks like a problem, but it is a part of the natural process and cycle of the way things happen with beaver ponds. And over time, of course, that can grow back in and forms habitat for the wildlife that live in that area, or forage base for agriculture. And so I just want to thank a number of folks who helped with some of the imagery in this presentation, in addition to our own imagery, and also encourage people to really think like a watershed. Think about the bigger picture, the connections to neighbors, neighboring landscapes, and look at also some of the other next steps. So I'll just tell you about a few of the things that we're working on with our collaborative. We're continuing to do more beaver awareness and sort of learn new tools and techniques, share those demonstration sites and tour them, building that community of practice of multiple people knowing how to install these things appropriately, looking for opportunities to learn from failure as well as success, and tracking the health changes over time of these sites. From an ecological perspective, MIISTAKIS has been completing a survey on knowledge and perceptions about beavers, and so we're looking forward to the results that will be released from that work shortly, and continuing to promote sound management, not just about beavers, but about landscapes that beavers have around them, riparian management, upland management generally, and that's part of our core mandate. Is beavers are just one of the aspects which we need to factor into our management practices and choices. We will be having a great symposium with some really excellent speakers, both from research to municipalities to landowners. So that's December 7th, 2017. But there's also a lot of other resources which we have generated with our partners, and you can check out the YouTube channel for some of those videos. And if you get a chance, of course, we are looking forward to getting evaluation and feedback from all of the work we do. So please feel free to contact us as well. And with that, we're going to wrap up the webinar. I just want to acknowledge our funding, which allowed this to happen, a big part of which is from the WRRP, Watershed Resiliency and Restoration Program, as well as the Calgary Foundation. And part of the grant for this larger collaborative also came from the TD Friends of the Environment Foundation. And that's beaver-related focused work, but I also want to acknowledge all the supporters for cows and fish. I encourage you to contact us in one of the formats that we have out there in terms of Facebook, Twitter, or our website, and contact our staff in your area if you're interested, or myself for the province as a whole. And if there are any questions or comments, we'd be happy to receive them. Thank you.